Sups everybody, Mr. Sups here, back with more homework for Evolution of Video Games. Alright, let's get right into the lecture recap. And we were talking about the 16-bit war. The Super Nintendo versus the Sega Genesis. Genesis does what Nintendo don't. Nintendo is what Genesis isn't. All that jazz, that's what we're talking about. Now, the Genesis already had a leg up on Nintendo in terms of time frame, and they had a lot of games and a lot of things out. And they already had a very hefty share of the market, mostly due to Tom Kalinske, who was a fantastic businessman. What he really did was he cut down the Genesis's price point and aggressively marketed that thing. So Nintendo needed an answer for it, and they got it in the form of the Super Nintendo, which, when you look at it, was better in terms of technology. It had better processing stuff, had a lot more colors to it. Like, just to kind of show you how significant a leap in terms of, like, color and graphics that this thing had, the NES could have 512 colors. The Super Nintendo could have 32,000. And it used every color. But it really didn't do all that well in the beginning because they just kind of said, oh, we're Nintendo, get Mario, you'll like it, you love it, which you can apply that to now, or to Sony with the PlayStation 3, or to Microsoft with the Xbox One, or the 3DS, or the Vita. Yeah, the thing is, it's a common thing. But they kind of had a little rabbit in a hat in a corner that they didn't really know about, and that was Street Fighter 2. And I already did a video on this, on what it did, how impactful it was, so go watch that. I'll put a link in the description. So yeah, go watch that. Gist of it is, it was good, changed everything, and Nintendo got the best version. And people knew that, so they got the Super Nintendo for Street Fighter 2. And that's what really got the two really competing with each other. And this is kind of like the whole capitalism competition is good sort of philosophy at play, because when it came out, the Super Nintendo was $200 and the Genesis was $150. But then the Super Nintendo is like, you know what, no, we need more, so we're going to bump it down by about $20, $30. So does the Sega Genesis, and this kind of continues with a whole bunch of other stuff. And overall, it made it a very, very good time to be a gamer. Another thing that made it a good time to be a gamer was Myst, which was the first computer game to sell 1 million units. Now, that seems kind of weird, because, I mean, like, computer games, they were kind of insular, but they were still around, and 1 million units is good, but console games were selling, like, sevens of millions of games and stuff like that. One thing that we really discussed about it, one that, again, computer games are kind of niche, and one of the quotes that was from the beginning of this course, which I'll always remember, reason why PC games are still kind of niche in comparison to consoles, because the cost of making a PC that can actually decently run games, and the interface of a keyboard, which is good for some, but not for the 10 million people who bought a PS4. Another reason why PC games weren't all that great was the sound. And everyone really kind of said that it was a little tinny. Like, really didn't like the sound of old PC games, and even now, a lot of people really don't. And that was before a lot of sort of sound technology got into the computer, and as soon as a thing of hardware called a Sound Blaster, which actually made PC speakers sound good, instantly PC games started to become amazing, with games like Myst, and The Seventh Guest, and Doom. And that's actually where the next point goes, because also in this time, in 1993, we got Doom, and we got Mortal Kombat, two of the most infamously bloody games in gaming. And why are they so infamous? Because they made the ESRB. How that went down was Senator named Joe Lieberman did not like, he was concerned about how violent video games were at this point, and a lot of people were. In fact, a lot of people during the crash of 82, 83 were kind of saying, I told you so, on that kind of stuff, and it kind of came back with this in full force. So there was a trial, US versus video games, and they had some, let's call them experts, for the US side, and CEOs and people and lawyers from the video game side. Like, most notably, like, the main public faces in America for Nintendo and Sega. The trial, it was pretty big, got some national coverage, but what really happened, the main takeaway was that you need to rate your games. And instead of letting the government do it, which, let's be honest, having the government rate some stuff is kind of not all that great of an idea, the video game industry itself decided on its own thing, which was the ESRB. Now, the ESRB has changed slightly over the years, but the core of it is still what it was, and it's been kind of working. Sort of, maybe, which is what we're going to talk about in the discussion. But we're still on the recap, and the next major evolution of video games came in the form of discs, CD-ROMs, which both the big two were kind of experimenting with. Like, there was the Sega CD, which kind of sort of didn't work. And then there was a prototype of a Super Nintendo sort of disc system, which never really made it off the ground. And that's where some sort of corporate backstabbingness sort of happens. So what happened was that Nintendo didn't really have the resources in order to do it. They couldn't, like, just make one. So they tapped a big name company which did, and that was Sony. Yes, that Sony, as in PlayStation Sony. They made their deal. They were going to develop a sort of CD-based add-on to the Super Nintendo, and Sony said, yeah, we're going to do it in front of the world publicly, and then Nintendo backed out. Why? It's kind of confusing. There have been several sort of alternate reports, from like rights issues to piracy scares. It's still kind of murky and secretive of why, but they did. And Ken Kutaragi, the guy at Sony who was actually developing this, actually had a working sort of prototype, took it to his boss and said, I still have this. Can I make more? And the boss said, go for it. And then lecture ends. So today we're talking about censorship in the video game industry. And once again, we were linked an article that was a PDF, so can't link it to you, so it'll be on the screen. And there was another article that I can link to you, that I chose, that I will link in the description. The article that we were given was about the 2005 sort of storm that happened over Grand Theft Auto's San Andreas' Hot Coffee mod. Now, for those who don't know, or those who forgot, here's what happened. Grand Theft Auto San Andreas had a mod called Hot Coffee that was essentially a sex scene. And Senators Joe Lieberman, remember him, he was back with the ESRB inceptionness, Hillary Clinton, and Evan Bay, I don't know how to pronounce his name, it's B-A-Y-H, They were sort of leading the forefront for a call for legislation to control video games because this stuff is being sent to minors and won't anyone think of the children? That kind of stuff. It's very sort of negative. That's what the article is talking about. And a lot of the legislation and a lot of the rhetoric was very inflammatory, that video games are all violent and they're preying on your kids and your ignorance, parents. And a lot of the legislation was rather vague, which was very kind of sweeping statements, which is actually where the other article comes in. This one was on The Escapist, and recently China lifted a ban on the sale of foreign game consoles, which means, like, PlayStations, Xboxes, Nintendos can be sold in China now. However, there's some caveats. They have a set of standards, and if the games being sold on the platforms don't live up to that standards, then they can't be sold. So if a game includes any of the following, they can't be sold in China. Gambling, gambling-related content or game features, anything that violates China's constitution, anything that threatens China's national unity, sovereignty, or territorial integrity, anything that harms the nation's reputation, security, or interests, anything that instigates racial/ethnic hatred or harms the ethnic traditions and cultures, anything that violates China's policy on religion by promoting cults or superstitions, anything that promotes or incites obscenity, drug use, violence, or gambling, anything that harms public ethics or China's culture and traditions, anything that insults, slanders, or violates the rights of others, or other content that violates the law. That statement is so broad that you could use it as a sword in the next Final Fantasy game, which is the kind of stuff that was being thrown around in 2005, and a lot of news outlets were calling Congress out on this. And a lot of that they were arguing was that this is violating the First Amendment. You are saying that you cannot do this, you cannot do that, you are violate their right to free speech. And a couple of articles kind of took this a step further, calling out Congress on why now? Why are they attacking Grand Theft Auto now? The article has multiple quotes from like the New York Times and Los Angeles Times and other places, but I think the Los Angeles Times quote is probably the best example of this. The Los Angeles Times similarly was struck by the public outcry over the hidden sex scene, given that the main thrust of the games encourages players to buy drugs, shoot cops, destroy property, beat up assorted passerbys, and hire prostitutes, killing them afterwards so the player don't have to pay. The editorial writers asked readers to forgive us if we fail to share in the indignation over the news that the game also contains a single explicit sex scene. The article states, well, the Times ultimately agreed with Congress, saying it's like, yeah, this is kind of the stuff needs to stay out of the kids, but they concluded that federal regulation of video games is probably pointless. But there is something that I do kind of get about a lot of the stuff that's being thrown around in these two articles. Like with China's guidelines, anything that instigates racial or ethnic hatred or harms ethnic traditions or cultures, and anything that insults, slanders, or violates the rights of others. In all honesty, it's like, yeah, those are very broad statements to be put in, like, laws, but in all honesty, that's the kind of stuff that you shouldn't be doing anyway. In the sort of entertainment sphere, the industry and the audience, there is this pushback to censorship in any and all form. And considering that America is one of the major entertainment powerhouse, this is very understandable, considering that the First Amendment is the First Amendment, freedom of speech. It's one of the biggest signs we wave around, along with flags saying America. But in all honesty, there was a reason why the ESRB was put in place. It was for self-censorship. And there are certain things that you just don't do. You just don't say in mixed company. Yeah, if you're cool with someone, you can say that, but in the entertainment industry, and even just culture as a whole, me talking with you, there's just certain things that you just don't say. You just don't put on screen. You don't put on paper because they are inflammatory, kind of wrong, and all that stuff. And that's why the ESRB was created. It was created because the game industry didn't really have a way to do that, a sort of way to rate things. Saying, you know what, this is probably not for little Timmy. But Teen Johnny might say that. Or College Student Joe, yeah, he might like this. And that's something that people, not just the game industry, not just gamers, everyone really needs to be aware of. Just have some sort of social consciousness about just what you're doing and what you're saying. Is censorship in video games justified at all? Actually, yeah, it kind of is. But not out of a, I don't want you saying anything about me, Mr. Powerful, but more in of, yeah, don't drop the N-word. It's the sort of things that kind of common sense, really. Now, there is no sort of, like, base level of what common sense is, But still, this is the sort of things that need to be worked out, and that's what the ESRB did and continues to do.